Welcome to the AT series, a closer look at access. Today's session by Karen is the first in a 5-part series. My name is Tammy Thompson-Cook, and I'm an educational consultant at the Patent Office in the Eastern region. I will be monitoring the questions and the chat window throughout the session. We at Patent are pleased to have Karen Kangas presenting on such an important topic, and we have greatly appreciated her collaboration with the many intermediate unit assistive technology consultants who support the assistive technology needs across the state of Pennsylvania. Karen, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you for you to get us started.
Okay, thanks, Tammy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to old friends and new friends and old AT people and new AT people. I'm hoping that this series that we've set up, that each one, although it is a separate issue, and you can see the descriptors there, they actually have been set up to build upon each other, but they aren't dependent upon the one that happens before them. So today, I couldn't resist still that we needed to go over looking at the basics and just doing a review for some of you, terminology and definitions and some standards and traditions of that historical use of access. The reason I do that is not just because of my age, but is because I hope you will get a sense conceptually, not only of where we've come to and where we are now, but we now are still missing some very important points that were brought up when I first got involved in the field and we started looking at things. So I'm hoping that this will help all of us not only feel assured that we're speaking the same language, but at the same time that we are conceptually and foundationally sound in our use. First, I want to give you a definition of access, and these first two definitions are ones that I actually developed as I look at access as an occupational therapist for everything. So whether it's access to assistive technology or not, this is a more generic look at when we're talking about access, and it's how an individual is able to manage an activity of interest with intention independently. So access is paired with activity, and it has to do with the individual managing that activity. And that management, of course, is going to depend upon experience as to how much we manage it. And when we start getting to now assistive technology, we're going to talk about how we manage a particular machine, because we're assuming in technology, we're looking at a computer or computer-based product. So that we're looking at a particular machine that we're dealing with at a particular time for a specific activity, which will produce an output, vocal or printed, or both. However, I wanted to make sure that we also understood we were going to talk about access, particularly to AAC and or augmentative and alternative communication. And that's ASHA's definition for that specifically, again, is straightforward: the way an individual makes selections on a communication board or speech generating device. So when we start looking at the history of access for AT, and the reason I have AT first, then AAC, is because I'm talking about as technology. It began really with computers. And what happened is we were dealing with individuals who were adults who either had a complex acquired injury, like a high-level spinal cord injury, or they had a degenerative disease progression like MS, muscular dystrophy, ALS, SMA, any one of those, or could even have arthritis, could have had a stroke. And so with the really beginning of access was looking at computers, and because you wanted to control the computer, how did we control the computer? We actually controlled it with a keyboard. So the beginning of access was looking at how we manage keyboards. And the reason I bring that up is the way we have the hardware we have is due to engineers. And engineers think not only historically, but they think in the paradigms of which that hardware exists. And so it will make a lot of sense to you how some of the organizational strategies we have today are based on the fact that we still are looking at a computer with a keyboard. At the time, when we first started AAC, we didn't have dedicated devices. We didn't have text to speech. I know that sounds absolutely wild to some of you who are young. And AAC strategies really included the use of communication boards, books, and ETRANs. And if you're not familiar with the ETRAN, it was an eye gaze system. You'll see some pictures of those in just a few minutes. Symbols systems actually were not there as they are now in sets. Symbol systems were being developed. And spelling was being used, photos were being used, and bliss symbols. Some of you may not know about Bliss, Mr. Bliss, and I always forget if he's John or Charles. So one of you might be able to open up the chat. Maybe he's James. I can't remember. I only think of him as Mr. Bliss. But Mr. Bliss developed a symbol system because he wanted everyone to speak the same language. He believed in world peace. What a wonderful idea that is, and thought that if we could all speak the same language, we could get along. What I learned about it is I learned about it with Shirley McNaughton, who was a teacher of kids with special needs in Toronto, who used it extensively because she was concerned as a teacher that instead of developing arbitrary symbols or just adding photos, she wanted a symbol system that followed some rules and also built upon each other so that it replicated or resembled a language, which Bliss Symbols is a language. So she wanted it already to begin to assist that brain part of us that's looking at orthography and reading and writing, as opposed to having a series of arbitrary symbols. Bruce Baker at the time began MinSpeak with multiple meaning icons, so there was not unity. There isn't who you see as MinSpeak now. He had not even developed word strategies. Different speech therapists in the field did develop some software, but I will tell you in the very beginning, it was just everybody was saying, well, let's look at, in AAC, let's look at symbol systems. Let's look at how we're going to help with communication. The configurations were very creative, but they were also extremely arbitrary. And you could get into any group of therapists, well, again, primarily speech therapists, but also a lot of teachers who are working with kids who are non-speaking. And I'm happy to say there were several of us OTs there too. And I'm sorry to say not so many PTs, but OTs definitely there, because OT definitely, we've been involved with functional communication our whole career. So we are right in there. And you could have over a glass of wine, a beer, or a cup of coffee, or all of the above, long discussions about these configurations and why we set them up the way that we did, or what we were trying to do. That's when I started learning about the Fitzgerald key sentence structure and color coding, which you now will see. So some people were strictly Fitzgerald key. And for those of you who don't know about it, that's something you can very easily Google and look up. So it's looking at sentence structure and doing some color coding to assist someone looking at it, that the color codes would help match, some grammatical sentence structures. Of course, again, as an OT, and then we had teachers who were dealing with kids with visual impairments, and we were also dealing with teachers who dealt with young children. We quickly recognized we had to pay a lot of attention to contrast, and what were those contrast considerations, and what was the size of the font, or what were the size of the photos, or what were the size of the pictures, or what were the size of the symbols. So size became a big issue. We started playing with the whole idea of looking at, when we look at young children, how do we know that when we're dealing with text with young children, we're dealing with bigger fonts, larger fonts. And when does it start to shrink down and get smaller? And we also know, as we were looking at young kids, where was that font on a page? What were those same kind of things that was happening? But the one thing we all did agree, and that remains true today, all of access is direct or indirect. So all of access is direct or indirect. Direct selection means that you are directly touching your device with a finger, hand, fist, or foot. Now, I will tell you, I've had some very interesting kids try it also with their nose. It could be a knuckle, like that, but it is a direct touch. Now, the only exception to that in this day and age is that direct selection, we consider eye gaze a direct selection technique. The difference is, I want to talk to you about it, why to me it is not still it is a directive selective technique, which we'll talk about in just a bit. If you could not use the finger, hand, fist, or foot directly, okay, then we get offered an assistance of a head stick, a mouth stick, or a hand grip that had a pointer. You're going to see pictures of those too in just a minute. So that those still would be attached to the body, and the body would then make those direct selections again on a communication board. So imagine a communication board. Now, an ETRAN, unlike the eye gaze technology we're using, could also be directly accessed with the eyes, because the eyes were looking at those direct symbols. They were looking directly instead of touching. Okay, so the thing is how were these boards and everything, how did they become communicative? Well, communication occurred through partner assisted scanning. The partner had to interpret what the person was pointing at. So just pointing to something, because there was not on a machine, clearly it wasn't doing anything. And I want to tell you, anybody involved with AAC from the very beginning, when we were dealing with non-technological devices, became a better communication partner. This is the thing that I still feel is very, very, very important, and we need to be looking at it much more carefully. We couldn't, if you're using a manual system only, or we now call them low tech. The reason I laugh about low tech is I'm not sure it's technology. I know some people like to think that technology are glasses or our hearing aids. Well, it is true. There's some computer stuff in the hearing aids. There are some computers help make our glasses, but I still would like to say that I think there's basic devices, and then there are there are technological devices. And those technological devices are machines. And in those machines, they are programmable and they have some computer chips within them. So I believe everybody should, it's really, really important that everybody have both systems, kinds of systems. So let's look at this ETRAN. So those of you who didn't know about an ETRAN, if you haven't seen them, and I still believe in them strongly, it is a plexiglass device. And the reason it was set up this way is so that there still could be face-to-face configuration. Now, some of them started out with a code. So this is an adult who's going to be a speller. And so he would look up to a corner, and then the partner would identify, oh, you're looking at this, so this is the group you want. And then for him to choose A, he actually looked at this same targeting area, that was A, but this targeting area would have been B. So this targeting areas matched the configuration of these 6 letters. So he would look at A, and other times you could look at A and then he could look at D, and he could look directly at those and help direct through here. She, on the other hand, the communication partner, can choose this either to be a coded system that she's decoding, or she can watch the eyes and she will repeat what's going on, because she's going to look at where his eyes went, and she's then going to validate with this person which was the choice. Okay, here's the ETRAN being used with a little kid. Okay, again, so it's meant to be clear so that the communication partner can see where the eyes are looking, and this standardly started with these 4 corners. Okay, and the reason the center was open is so that the communication partner and they both could see each other. Here you can see it kind of just laying down on its own in terms of having some symbols. Now, what I wanted to tell you is I wanted to also share one of the things that I felt was, and this, I did not include this on the handout, I'm sorry to say. I realized last night I forgot to put this in, but I can't remember who to give credit for this to, because this was very, very early on in my career, but it was when I was traveling up in Canada. I do know that. And an ETRAN, instead of where you saw the 4 corners, this is traditional, that you're going to start with the 4 corners and then you fill in these side areas, but you start in the 4 corners to help people learn those. Okay, instead, if we go back at this ETRAN, imagine that these 4 pictures are not there, and instead the teacher added up here yes, and down here yes, and added no here and no here. And so in terms of adding yes no questions, those 2 places were filled yes and no, so that when the child would look up or look down, it was imitating the gestural yes. And if they'd look to the left or look to the right, they could do either one or one. And if you looked at, if you were, for instance, if you were saying no and you looked to the left and the teacher said, I didn't get that, and you looked again, so your gesture, you actually are helping the person imitate gestural movements that are common movements we also use for yes or no. I thought that was brilliant. And I think that's something that I would like us to use. Another thing is, I just wanted to, it reminded me of, we're going to leave ETRAN, but I wanted to talk about, we dealt with spelling. You could see that we started with ETRANs and we did with spelling. Symbols were still being developed, but we were always starting with spelling with our older kids and also with adults. And I saw a letter chart, instead of it just being an alphabetical array, a letter chart that you looked at the vowels were on one side and the rest of the letters that followed in an alphabetic array. Okay, so instead of worrying about this looking pretty and being even, we had the vowels here. And the reason this started out is the communication partner would hold this board up, and the partner would then direct you. You would auditorily say, is it in the A row? Is it in the E row? Is it in the I row? Is it in the O row? Is it in the U row? Okay, and then the person could somehow vocalize or signal gesturally that it was in the A row. And then you would say, is it A? Is it B? Is it C? If the person said C because they wanted to spell can, then you would say C. Okay, and the communication partner would write down C, and then they would go back and say, is it in the A row, E row, I row, O row, U row? Now, what's brilliant about this is, again, and I will tell you because my sister had ALS, is this chart can be easily learned by a reader and a writer in your head so that you can quickly give up. It's something that can be a shortcut of spelling very, very quickly with somebody in any situation, shower, hospital, bathroom, beach, whatever, in terms of assisting someone who's a speller. Anyway, all right. Our communication boards and books looked like this. You may see them. So these, I'm just showing you some samples of books so we can have, again, there are some color codings. You can have multiple pages. They were overlays. We could have books that, this book is resembling what was a manual board. When I first began, we had giant oak tag, just exactly like poster board. And we then used to fold it into thirds so that it could open up like a map, and you could fulfill both sides. And again, here we're using some color coding here. This, again, this board, instead of it being just like this one, that's just the page is at a normal size page in a book, this one was actually doing a flip out version. Okay. So partners would read, or they would repeat what the user would directly select. Okay, the partner would sometimes assist if reaching those corners or reaching across a line was a problem. The partner would sometimes assist, and they could assist by themselves pointing or by requesting. Okay, the partner also would frequently anticipate a choice. And I want to say now, when we're first talking about young kids, oh, this is another thing. You could have a beer or wine or something and have a huge argument. There was a huge argument field. Should you ever allow the partner to anticipate the choice? Because if you're anticipating what the person is spelling, or you anticipate what they're about to say, are you taking over their independence? I have to tell you now that what I find interesting is I work with many, I still see a lot of people I met, individuals I met who were kids who are now adults. And they use AAC devices, but they also have to have methods that they can communicate with that are not using their AAC device. And I have to tell you, to a one, they do like that their partner anticipates the choice, because it speeds up communication. Now, why would we not want to anticipate the choice? Well, if it's a paraprofessional helping a child in the classroom, it may be the person may be anticipating a correct answer or leading the child. But I have to tell you, if you're with a communication partner a lot, they're very, very happy that you anticipate their choice to speed up the communication of them being able to give you an idea of what they wanted to say to you. Now, just like I said, if the user couldn't manage direct selection or could only partially manage direct selection, the partner would assist vocally. This was the beginning of what we call auditory scanning. So the partner would then, so if an individual had on their head stick or chin stick or a pointer and had trouble, could not manage the direct selection all the time or always to different situations, the partner would read what those lines were. They would read those symbols. They would call them out. Okay, and they would allow the person, the user of the communication system would then be able to let you know which was the selection they wanted to target. Okay, so the partners, again, they would identify either the words, and the user would choose that word or symbol. And now the problem began as this vocabulary grew, and this is still today. Still today, this is an issue. What happens when vocabulary grows? What happens when we have to deal with multiple pages? How do we organize it? So It was in these manual systems or basic systems that categorization grew into quadrant, row, column, word, symbol lists. So that means if we look back at these, okay, although a quadrant, and the reason I use the quadrant is because when we originally identified on communication devices, we divided into quadrants because machines like things to be of a certain size. So you can see here, we've got a whole yellow page, we've got a grouping that's pink and another page that's purple and that's part blue. If instead I said to you quadrants, what I really mean is, I should have had a picture here of a quadrant, but a quadrant would be that we divide this page into 4. Okay, but right now, if I wanted to use the same idea of quadrant scanning, quadrant just means that on our machines we divide it into 4. I would say to the user at first, is it in the yellow? Is it the blue? Is it the pink? Or is it the purple? And then when I got to the yellow, is it in the first line, the second line, the third line? And when I get to the yellow, I could even say, is it the blue? Is it the green? Is it the white? Okay, because row column this is a part that was very confusing to me, is although we're going across the row and these are columns, okay, so I'm going across the row, but when I choose this, it's actually called a column choice, but they're actually single choices. So these are the rows, these are the columns. So quadrant just means area, and then in that specific area, we're going to deal with singular situations. And I want you to know that, because when we start dealing with scanners, it's really important that we are also using that same visual and motor image in other activities we do. We should start to recognize that we are dealing with groups, and then we are dealing with those groups. They can be color coded, but we're still dealing with them left to right and top to bottom. And then we're dealing with sections within that group. You know, what's interesting is that is a paradigm of also kids looking at books and learning text and looking at the pictures and then looking at the texts. So that paradigm is not going to hurt any child. It's actually going to help all children. If we started dealing with how we present materials and understanding that we're going to help children be ready to use their devices, we also are helping them understand categories. Okay, so now when we started dealing with AAC with computers, the first was just an alternative method of writing. So again, what we looked at there was managing the keyboard exactly like we were managing our communication boards. We were looking at, again, a head stick, a chin stick, a mouth stick. We were looking at one-handed keyboards. We looked at making the keyboard mini for a single finger or extended if it had to be a larger group. We also looked at what were called cord or bat, which were coded keyboards, which only had a few numbers, and they were like a shorthand keyboard, honestly. What you did is you learned to manage the letters by how you managed the chord, okay, because you could work with one hand. And of course, we started using Keyguards. Okay, we still used mouth stick, head sticks, chin sticks, and hand grips with pointers. So all of our kids that we're seeing now, that's what we were using for them to be able to try and manage a keyboard, because we were looking at direct selection. We didn't have the ability to deal with indirect selection because actually our computers didn't start out with any indirect selection. That began with the invention of the mouse. The mouse and a graphical interface changed everything, because now we were not going to be keyboard only. As we began to try and access issues. So now if the keyboard could be managed by an alternative mouse or mouse emulation, it really was the technology that allowed us to develop indirect selection. Okay, so if we start looking at mouth sticks, and these all happened still primarily with individuals who had high-level spinal cord injuries, people who had ALS, people only can move, but we began also use them with kids with cerebral palsy quite a bit. So this is just showing you a simple solution. I still remember meeting one of the best users of an AAC device I had ever seen, was a 17-year-old boy who had athetoid cerebral palsy, and he used a standard keyboard with his computer, and he then also used a parenchyromic device, which was called a touch talker, which was meant to be managed by a single digit. He would take a Bic pen, and he would pick it up with his mouth, and he would then push in the buttons like this, about this size, like this guy's doing with having an eraser tip. That's why I showed you this one, because I remembered him so well. And I remember asking him, would he like to change to something more technological? And he told me no. Why he liked that is he could go into any computer lab, he could find a Bic pen, and all he had to do was bite it a few times, and he could bite the plastic in to hold it in place, and then he could lean over the keyboard. And he had enough trunk control to be able to lean forward and use a standard keyboard, and then he didn't have to depend on anything being different. That didn't help him. That was before we had mice. So we were managing everything by the keyboard. When we were scrolling, we scrolled with arrow keys, which again took separate hits to move through a page. And he did it. And I just thought, again, that was brilliant. All right, so here you see somebody managing with a very long stick. Here's someone with just a eraser on the end of what looks like a pencil. Here's another guy. This is actually a very current picture. And again, we will still frequently see people who have spinal cord injuries, like when they see they have a mouth stick, they still prefer that because they don't have to worry about any kind of software delineation. And the reason we're going to talk about that is when we talk about still managing a computer much like it was designed, if we can manage a computer much like it was designed, it still is often the most efficient. When we start talking about putting an on-screen keyboard, and I love everybody's like, okay, well, we want everything to be on the screen. I want to tell you, then you have not really used an on-screen keyboard a lot. Still managing an on-screen keyboard is a challenge. We're going to talk about that more as we get into access. Okay. Some of you who may never seen a hand grip with a pointer, this is what they look like. They still are around, okay? And again, but you can again imagine this is for somebody who is weak. If you've got a kid who has cerebral palsy, this isn't always very helpful for them, and because they still can't isolate that arm to be able to move it around. So that's really for somebody weak. Keyguards were amazing. Okay, so Keyguards not only allowed you to use a pen and reach a little thing so the head stick and mouth stick wouldn't hit the wrong buttons. You can see here somebody just using a pen, but it also allowed kids who could rest. And when we had the physical keyboards like this, a kid can rest on the keyboard and then get their finger into the holes and can slide along the Keyguard. And I think sometimes we forget that. And like when we have the Keyguard over here, although this Keyguard has separated these into 4 issues, it hasn't helped with your hand with direct selection, because what will happen is if you touch this, the chances of you being able to fall in and touch this one. So this Keyguard that actually looks more simple and you think is easier to touch, actually this Keyguard was actually more helpful because there's more of it that you can rest on the guard to then be able to push this with a finger, a knuckle, or your hand, but you can slide along this whole area. When you've made it this simple, see how I've actually removed the targeting area is larger, but that means when I fall in it, I have trouble getting out of it to get to another one. Okay. When we're looking at a mini keyboard, the other thing I wanted to say that I'm not seeing enough today, and that is the frequency of use keyboard configuration. So this was meant again for somebody who had weakness and could either use their finger or could use a pointer. And what you see is the most frequently used letters are the closest to the center, and the letters used less frequently are outside of that. So that if you were working with this in terms of one hand, or you were also using a mouse stick or a head stick, it would be easier that you wouldn't have to reach all around the QWERTY keyboard. And so this was a mini keyboard developed for that. And again, just can work amazingly well for people in terms of getting it. It can also have a keyguard. this was an expanded keyguard, so it's hard to see. I had trouble getting these pictures of things that I used all the time when I was already are 20 years old. But I have to say, I'm very concerned that we still don't have some of these around, that we've gone totally to everything being digitized instead of still having, particularly for young children, that we aren't having an opportunity for them to have the physical management of a keyboard. But this was an expanded keyboard, which is, by the way, I will tell you that the length of this and the size of this was just about, I would say this was 30 inches. 30 inches by 24 inches. So you can see that that was quite large, and they could come in an alphabetic array. We next have something that I was just in love with, and that was Intellikey. So this was a board that we actually could program how we want it to be. So it could be an expanded keyboard. We could make them certain sizes. We could make it be this same size. We had overlays that literally physically set on top of it, although we programmed it to look a certain way. And it was an expanded keyboard, and it could also be manage arrows. We could have it be all different kinds of targeting areas, because we were actually able to change that. And the first expanded keyboard was actually called a unicorn board. And the reason it was called a unicorn board is because it was an expanded keyboard used by someone who used a head stick. And so in Australia and in parts of Canada, they used to call that a unicorn board, because you had something on your head that was a pointer. That's where that came out. I am still sorry that we don't have these physical configurations for our young children to use. And that's because anybody could use them. We could have very young children on keyboards very early with each other. And one of the children could be having a disability, the other children not necessarily, but still just learning. And we have the ability to alter those arrays. And we also have them a physical interaction with the real activity of learning cognitively what all these parts are and what is this whole thing we're going to call writing. This is just another example of a single-handed keyboard. This single-handed keyboard, and for those of you who, if you ever do meet a child or in your schools who is in some kind of an accident or has had a stroke, these kind of things can work very well. This is a corded keyboard, and that's what I mean, is it literally, it's called a chord, like chords on a piano, and you learn various chords will actually spell things out. Okay. Meanwhile, now we're going to go back into the AAC field as simple technology was beginning to be used. So when I talk about simple technology, we started having battery operated toys long before we started having AAC devices. But we started realizing with those battery operated toys, now I want to tell you, battery operated toys by themselves are not fun. The fireman going up the ladder to nowhere is not fun. I mean, it's only fun if you've never seen it before, but after you have touch the switch and the little fireman goes up. But again, I told you in the beginning, we were all about activity, access to activity. We wanted children to be engaged. So that little battery operated fireman, we would have a house. It could have been a farm, could have been any one of the little farm toys that we now get all the time, Fisher Price farms that we have in animals, okay? And we could put that little battery operated toy, but that now the fireman would go up the ladder to put out the fire that was happening in the barn. And we could be reading a story about firemen, we could be reading a story about the farm, we could have children participating with their battery operated toys as a part of activity. So that's really how battery operated toys first began, not to be something that sat on a tray for you to just have the little monkey go, you know, and bang the chimes and stuff, which, like I said, any kid who does that is going to do that in 2 seconds and not. And the children who keep going back to that and back to that and back to that and back to that, guess what? Those are our kids who are either perseverative, and that perseveration almost always we now know is a sign of being on the spectrum, that in fact, we're running into some repetitive issues that are actually avoiding activity. Anyway, our first really early devices were then simple battery operated things. So we had a dial scan or a clock communicator. So it really was a circle, and we were able to plug a switch into it, and the switch would move along the dial or the clock, and we would put symbols on there. So we didn't have speech. We had symbols that we were making selections, but those selections so that somebody else could see them. We also had light boxes. And I mean, literally a Zygo 100 had 100 lights. And then it had physical laminated overlays that you put on top of them, and you could put symbols that you either Velcroed on there, and the person would hit the switch along those 100 lights, and they would make that selection because the light would light up the selection. So there were simple light boxes, and I couldn't find a picture of any of those, but I could find a picture here of various choices of clock communicators. Okay, so this one was clear. And so what you were expected to be able to do was, if it was clear, the communication partner could see where you were headed. Here's one that actually had different things on it. Most of the time you created these on your own, okay? And many of them looked like this so that they functioned as a step scan, okay? So one hit of your switch moved it along, All right. It wasn't that you held the switch and it moved and moved and moved and moved and moved and moved, unless you had a homemade one. Sometimes that happened. And that was the beginning of inverse scanning. So I held on to the switch. The dial would go around and around and around and around and around. When it got to the one I wanted, I let go of the switch. And so when I let go of the switch, that was my selection. Here's just another example of how of again another communication clock. Okay. So scanning, when it began, which means indirect selection. So we're not going to touch the keyboard. We're not going to touch the communication board. We're not going to wear a head stick or a chin stick. We're going to do scanning. And in order to do that, it was always linear and it was always step scanning. That meant one switch had moved you one step along that light box or one step along that clock. And so even circular scanning was a linear scan, meaning that it was going in one direction, one way, and one switch activation moved one space. And all I can tell you is that was really wonderful about that is that it is true we didn't have large arrays, but I will tell you is children were getting a lot of practice with one-to-one correspondence. And I'm sorry to say, we have gotten off the beaten path of understanding how cognition develops by getting so hung up on cause and effect and believing that switches are teaching a kid causality. They are not. And managing something within a piece of an app teaching causality is not necessarily doing that. But our kids aren't having any experience with one-to-one correspondence. I don't know if some of you have forgotten matching is an underlying method of us dealing with one-to-one correspondence. I found one yellow one and another yellow one, and they look the same, and I want them to be together. Now I have two yellow ones, okay, two red ones, matching. And all of that one-to-one correspondence, the beginning of matching colors and matching shapes, is the beginning of us understanding categorizations and recognizing same and different. And guess what that is? That is the underlying feature of us being able to read and also to write. And if you think that we're not using similar strategies, even if you're dealing with a kid who will not become a traditional reader, which we now know from a lot of research is the way we're teaching them, that most kids can become traditional readers. But even if we weren't and we were using symbols, how do they distinguish the difference between symbols? How are we asking them to recognize how we deal with symbols? And I want to bring up when we start talking about that again, and access and its relationship to what it's accessing has everything to do with everything. Right. I now wanted to show you some of these older systems. So this we then began. This is one of our first communication devices, and that was used that we did. We were doing direct selection, but we were doing it in a more. Instead of using a head pointer, we had a light pointer. So we had an infrared receiver, and this little boy is wearing a homemade headpiece, because the hardest thing for our kids with CP is most of the headgear looked a lot of like the headgear now you still see if someone's wearing a head mic. So it's just a little wire around, a little wire's tinier than what hold earmuffs and, hold your little speaker. Well, kids with cerebral palsy, it wouldn't stay on their heads. And again, light pointing didn't start with kids with cerebral palsy. Light pointing began with people who had ALS. So it could be that same little thing. They only had to move a little bit to be able to make it work. But for our little kids, I can't tell you how many hours I devised with families, and we came up with all different kinds of ways to hold a headlight. And it actually we actually paired up an infrared light, because you can't see infrared. We paired it next with a real light. So we had a battery operated little flashlight, and you had to calibrate those two so that the child would see the light, but it would be the infrared sensor that was actually making the selection in the device. And this is our early masking. Okay, so our early masking was literally just cutting Post-its out and sticking them in there. Okay, putting the sticky part back. And we actually covered things up. So this is a 5-year-old, okay, and using a light talker. And in terms of the thing I really liked about it is, again, if I then moved that light talker out of the way as we were teaching to do with that, I could bring a communication board over and he could make selections with his light, not the infrared sensor, because the infrared sensor was only working with that, but the light could choose things on a communication board. The light could choose objects. He could wear that, and he could choose what he wanted for lunch. He could choose what items he wanted. you know, we could do all different kinds of things because we gave someone a selection technique that was not only working on their AAC device. This is the same little boy, and I want to tell you, people were so excited. He was one of the very first kids in Pennsylvania's loaner program that we started working with technology. And what happened is as I got to see him, people began to know me that not only did I care about AAC, but I also obviously cared about seating and mobility. And this was a little add-on unit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because it's no longer available. I wish it were. But it came with membrane switches, which are considered the lightest touch switches. Okay, but you have to touch them with your hands. And what will happen is so this boy, little boy who was really, really good with his head, was supposed to be able to drive his chair. You can't see that there's a battery pack underneath here and attached to the wheels. But every time he would attempt to touch, he could not get enough push to push on the switch, although it was the lightest touch switch available. And as he would try to, often the other arm would come onto it, and then he would end up pushing two switches. And so what was interesting is nobody was understanding at that time still that we could head point, but they didn't understand we could do anything else. And so what I wanted to show you is that I did switch at that time. I put typical switches up by his head, mechanical switches, and there are 3 of them that I just Velcroed onto the back of his piece. And he is driving, and when his hands were free and he could drive with his head, I wanted you to see this is the very first thing he did, is he went right over. In their classroom there was a piano, and when he could drive, he immediately went over to use his hands for the piano, which this was the very beginning of me really, really understanding how I wanted kids as much as possible to have their hands free so that they could be engaged in the real activity, of course, which is playing the piano. Okay, so we then needed to combine keyboard access. Devices began, then we started developing the ability to use digitized speech, and speech synthesis happened at the same time. So some people were actually recording things in advance, so kids just chose pre-recorded situations, but we also had speech synthesis and text-to-speech. Those were all happening at the same time. Computers started moving into dedicated systems, and the direct selection was still the basis of the use of these devices. And I want to tell you that still today, this is still true. Programmabilities of these devices allowed for a larger target or keyguard use, but an indirect selection or linear scanning was still available. Okay, so here are two young men. Again, I met them as children. Both of them to this day use, this young man is now 45. This guy's in his almost 40, all right? And they still prefer to use their communication devices with their head sticks. He can also use it without. He actually manages 4 different computers, standard keyboards at work, 4 different computers at work. He works full time and has 4 people who work for him. I next wanted to show you, I wanted to introduce you to Ted because actually, again, something Ted did, we used to have these little, we used to have a single switch that attached to a tone. And what would happen is that you hit the switch, it would activate the tone. So that tone could be a buzzer, that tone could be a sound, okay? And what Ted did, Ted had been in a terrible car accident, and he had a little bit of movement between this hand and this thumb and this finger. He did not have head control. Although he had a lot of spasticity in his lower extremities, his upper extremities were very, very weak and loose. He had a little bit of movement again because he had this huge brain injury. What he figured out as soon as a switch was placed between his fingers that he would do, he would hit the switch once for yes and twice for no. But if he got very, very excited, he would then hold on to it, or he would hit it multiple times. So it would go or and again, are we not using some very simple strategies like this? He used that as an attention getter. He always had it with him. So it would be like his call bell for an attendant. It would be a call for you to come over and talk to him. He would answer questions with it or yes and no. And he could also tell you he was very excited through a simple activation of a single switch. This action, this functional use of just a sound and a switch, I find that we have gotten too hung up in high tech and aren't recognizing the power of using that. Okay, so when we started looking at this whole automatic scanning, we started recognizing that we still wanted to move from left to right and top to bottom. The switch activation was going to interrupt this automatic movement to make a choice. So the choice, still the movement of it was as if we were moving a cursor. So the engineers in our mind were saying, we are moving a cursor along the communication device, and we are then going to make a selection. So how scanning began to develop was through the use of it imitating how a mouse worked. We're going to move it around, and then we're going to make a selection. Okay. Inverse automatic scanning is still available on many devices and does work for some kids. And that means that the user holds onto the switch the whole time and then actually stops activating the switch to be able to make a selection. Group row column organization is now available, and automatic scans with the quadrants was exactly happening on your device the same way it was happening on our communication boards. Same thing is still happening about the size of the display. And then we got the dynamic display. And the problem I still continue to have with a dynamic display is a dynamic display looks magical. If kids don't understand that there are multiple pages, and if you have a book, I still like to have a book, a physical book that has this, that looks like the pages of their dynamic display. So when they flip the page, I can show them in the book what's underneath there, so something magical isn't happening. But this multiple page movement became an issue that you had to hold on to a thought as you moved through many pages. Bruce Baker is the one who held on to, through MinSpeak, the demand that the display stay static so that we have a larger but never changing access to most of the words and symbols we're going to need throughout the day. And that's today is still an issue. Okay, so we today are paying a lot more attention for keyboard alternatives being on-screen keyboard. I'm also here to tell you that we are most dealing with laptops, but I want to tell you what's also interesting as an OT. The keyboard that's on a laptop was meant to be used when it's on your lap. That's how it was created, and it was created directly for businessmen who were traveling on planes and for people who had to be stuck in situations where they didn't have a desk. So a laptop was meant, that keyboard was meant to be used in your lap. And when that keyboard is in your lap, it is in a better position for you to use your hands. I use with my laptop, still use it, and when I am doing a work, I use external keyboard. And I think, again, those are some things we're going to talk about as we get into these next few weeks. I want us to recognize that indirect selection now is either single switch automatic scanning or two switch step scanning. So two switch step scanning is not breaking up an automaticity. It's the two switch step scanning is moving through steps that you have programmed. So the steps can be quadrants, then rows, then columns, then singular. And you're making your selection with another switch, okay? We also have auditory scanning, which can be one switch automatic scanning or two switch step scanning. So auditory scanning is replicating what we did in partner assisted scanning. The device is going to give you the word or the object or the label of the quadrant, of the color, or of what we're selecting. And we're either going to do that it's going to automatically occur with auditory prompts, or it's going to be two switch step scanning where you move into. We still have inverse scanning, and I believe really strongly in group row column. Okay. I next want to show you one other thing. This is an adult I worked with for many years too, who figured out his own system, and he used Morse code. And I will tell you, Morse code was an option when I began, and it can be something I'm hoping we may, if some of you have some questions, I wish it would come back into trend because some spellers do very, very well with Morse code. They can use two switches and they can then spell anything. Because Morse code itself is an encoded system. Okay, he was able to use one switch and be able to then, which he devised himself, that it was a one switch that did dual actions. So you could hold it for one for the dot, he would hold it a little bit longer than for the dash, for the dit, the dot and the dit. Okay. Oops, I already showed you that. Okay, directed selection is also available, and that's actually what's joystick or mouse control. Now, a lot of people think that the joystick is like a mouse, and it actually isn't. I mean, it moves. Yes, it can move like a mouse in 360 degrees, but how you handle the joystick does not move as easily as a mouse. And if it did, we would all have joysticks instead of mice. So a joystick is not as easy to move as a mouse if your hand is working well. But those two same things are working. The problem is that what everybody, when we talk about directed selection, it does allow the individual to move in multiple directions. But how do you make the selection when you get there, okay? However, if we are in directed selection, it does allow us to use multiple switches to manage mouse emulation. That means our devices can understand that we're going to emulate a mouse and the device will read it as a mouse. And when we get more into access, we'll talk more about that. Okay, so directed selection is more directions, but there are some unique requirements for how you're going to do selection. So engineers invented dwell time. And all I want to say to you is dwell time is a love-hate relationship. Because to make a selection, dwell time is actually you've chosen that the selection is going to happen by staying on that target for a certain period of time before, and timing is acting as the select switch. Or you have to have an additional action to be the switch. So eye gaze uses dwell too, and that's what I want to talk to you about. Eye gaze is not the same as using an ETRAN where you're looking directly at something, because you are looking directly at something, but you can't select it by just directly looking at it. When you're using an ETRAN, and you are looking directly, when you look directly at it, your partner knows exactly what you want. But when you're looking at eye gaze, your selection isn't made until you manage dwell. As soon as we're trying to manage dwell, and when we have a joystick and we move it around like a mouse, but how do we select it? We either have to have a separate switch, or we have to dwell, or we have to be able to nudge, or we have to do something that also has been developed. That's why I'm saying they are anything that is asking you to make a selection differently than just directly going after it is then not truly direct selection. So to me, most standard eye gaze systems are directed selection, because the select itself is not managed by you immediately looking at something. You're having to cope with dwell or with the separate switch to make configuration. We obviously have different kinds of trackballs as well. So we can give somebody can manage the whole key, can manage an on-screen keyboard, or can manage their device with an alternative mouse. So it could be a trackball that they could manage their device. Okay. And next, last but not least, I can't believe we only have 5 minutes. I tried to manage this, but we're going to talk more about switches, so I'm not too worried. But I wanted to lay the foundation here. All the switches themselves that we began dealing with were mechanical switches. Mechanical switches require force and 5 actions. They have to be located. That locate can be visual, and most often is. Then you have to touch it, press it, hold it, and release it. And what will happen is the hold varies based on what you're doing. If you were inverse scanning, the hold would be long. If you were driving a power chair, the hold would be longer. If you're making a selection if you're making a selection in a communication device, the hold would be short. But what happens is that because it requires these 5 actions, which means graded movement. So although engineers spent a lot of time trying to make mechanical switches lighter touch, but the lighter touch they met them because they were mechanical meant that our kids who had a lot of tone, they may have been easier to hit, but they still had to hit them. And that's because they couldn't just touch them, press, and hold. So when I ask you to manage a mechanical switch, every one of you, your touch, press, and hold happens so close together that you almost cannot separate them out to understand that they're separate actions. But our kids, that's why we talk about them hitting a switch. We began developing big max switches, so they would have big targets, thinking that was easier. And then we also started making the targeting areas shorter, because we had to leave, because we were now in indirect scanning, we had to leave step scanning, and we had to depend upon more on automatic scanning. And as we did that, we then asked the kid to wait longer before they made the hit. And engineers started playing with how long did it take for the switch hit to register? How long did it take for the release to measure? And these were arbitrary tenths of seconds that now are not predictable for a child. If a child is touching a switch, I want it to have immediate feedback. That switch is going to immediately act. And this whole confusion of dealing with mechanical switches, whether they were lighter touch or not, because lighter touch also meant they were more fragile. So if our more involved kids, we tried to give them a lighter touch switch, inevitably they would break them. And mechanical switches do break, and they also get dirty. So what I want to tell you, I have for over 15 years been using electronic sensors for AAC and power mobility. I use mechanical switches for activity-specific actions. We'll talk more about that as we get involved with access, because I want the switch I want it to become transparent as quickly as possible to the activity. So the child becomes engaged in how the device works, not only how the device works, the child is able to maintain knowledge of what they wanted to say, and then be able to get the device to say it and not think about what they have to do with the switch. So we are not limiting their target area. We can go back to step scanning if we need to, so our children can really do that, because zero pressure, no force electronic sensor requires only 2 action, and that's location and release, and it requires no force. And you can't break these switches. Okay, so what's going to happen? Here's a sample of a fiber optic switch. It's just a light, and it's just a pencil point. All we have to do is break this beam. Okay, so I'm showing how I'm going to break the beam, but if I'm working with a really young child, I want them to touch it. That's the most expensive electronic sensor you're going to have, but light travels quickly. Here's a proximity switch that someone's using with their knee. They just have to approach this target. When they're actually within 1/8 of an inch of this activation target right there, this switch is going to activate. They can certainly touch it. There's no moving parts. They're going to touch it and release. They're not going to hear anything. They're going to see on the screen of their communication device or computer what's happening. Here's using 2 other proximity switches at the head. One of them, we're using 2 switch scanning on, again, an AAC device. This one is moving him through the group row and columns, and this is his select switch. Or as Linda Burkhart would say, a go and get. Some people say move and select. I don't care what you call it, but one is the selection switch, or that's the click on your mouse. Okay. When I first start using these, I like to work with children, and I'm going to hold the switch very close to them, to their face. I don't care if it's at their chin, their head, or anything else. What I want them to become involved with is the movement of the activity that we're playing with. Okay, these can be used. I really like to use them at home. Lots of kids want to try and use them with their hand or their head. In the beginning, all we want them to do is get excited about what's on the screen. We want them to get excited about what's happening here. So I don't want to set that up in a head array or anything else. This is one where a mom is just holding the switch wherever the kid is to make the selection, because I want the kid to be able to fall in love with the game. Oh my God, I can't believe we're already over. I do want to tell you that just because that same kid was learning to do the switches, which she also uses eye gaze with her Tobii device. We still have 4 more weeks of another hour, and we will go more into switches. I hope this was helpful to you to kind of lay a foundation and a history of what was going on. And of course, any of you have direct questions to me, you can please feel free to email me, which is, my email address is on your handout, and it also was at the beginning of this situation. Hi, Tammy. That went fast.
Yeah, it was such a great hour of awesome information. And on behalf of Pat, and I'd like to thank you so much for the wealth of information that you shared with us today. Thank you all for joining us, and keep the conversation going by adding your thoughts and impressions and ideas and inspiration to the discussion board that's in Schoology, that's located directly below the main introduction in the Schoology page. Each week you'll find in the folders the Zoom link as well as handouts, which will be coming as they become available. I'd like to remind you that I added the survey verification code into the chat box, but it's also found in the orange folder for today's session on in the Schoology folder. Also, make sure that you do this before 4 p.m. on Tuesday. You have the whole weekend, hopefully the rest of today and tomorrow, the whole weekend. And then before 4 p.m. on Tuesday, you need to complete that verification code in order to receive Act 48, ACVREP hours, ASHA CEUs, site credit, and/or certificate of attendance for attending today's session. And you can find the links to log into each of the sessions, like I mentioned before, in each of the folders associated with the coming weeks. I hope you'll join us from start to finish. I'm glad we're here today, and I hope you'll join us for each session throughout the month of September.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for being here. And I hope you have a good Friday and nice weekend. See you next week.
Yeah, thank you. And also no code. So hopefully that's not a problem. But let me give you the survey information one more time. and no code for the survey, just confirming. But yeah. All right. All right, so no code for today's session. I'm typing in the chat window. Just please complete it before next Tuesday. All right, there we go. People are logging off. Thanks, Karen. That was awesome, as usual.
Okay. All
And
right.
we'll talk to you another day, and we'll look
Okay.
forward to your handouts soon.
Okay. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.